So my name's Sheridan Cook. I am a consultant with Accenture, but I am representing the work that I do on behalf of my client, Canada Health Infoway, to develop national and regional guides. And I'm joined today by
Rinnetmäki from Finland. Sensor Trend is a healthcare startup focused on type 1 diabetes. And in addition to that, I have the grandiose title of Fire Ambassador of HL7 Finland, the country affiliate.
You feel the burden on the ambassadorship there. So today, we want to see many faces that we know in the room. We want to really engage you guys to understanding kind of how the context of how standards work in our country impacts our ability to interrelate with guides that are developed in country, as well as interrelate with international specifications. We want to inform you of the work that ourselves and our colleagues are doing at an international level to try to understand how National IG authors are developing patterns and approaches to profiling and to try to become more harmonized in the process. And we want to drive excitement about some of the mechanisms that we'll hear about on the conference in the next couple of days, and that we'll be discussing on some of our Friday session that's a continuation of this work. And I'm just seeing if I can, getting some back feed, is it okay? You're not picking that up in the back? Okay. All right. So I want to provide just a little bit of context into how standards operate in Canada and context into why it can be sometimes challenging to do so in our ecosystem. Because at face level, we're a country with a relatively small populace for a land mass. We have socialized healthcare, but while we have effectively 10 jurisdictions and 3 territories that are combined into these jurisdictions, they hold sole responsibility in governing how healthcare is delivered, how healthcare and clinical practices are developed, as well as the vendor procurement practices within their jurisdictions. And so while there is federal funding that drives a lot of these healthcare activities, it's ultimately done at a jurisdiction by jurisdiction level. And I mention that because we have that in common with a lot of the other nations that are present here today and that are developing national IGuides, where we have to be able to navigate that compromise that we play both in our own countries and then the compromises that we have to negotiate with international guides. So our jurisdictions in Canada have a lot in common. They have more in common than they have in difference from each other. They share a lot of the same desires, use cases, the things that are keeping them up at night in challenges in their healthcare systems. They share a lot of the same vendors, and they share a similar age in their health IT infrastructure and a desire to refresh it in the right way. Now, the challenge is that even while a lot of these pain points are shared, the timelines in which they're tackled and when each jurisdiction tackles each use case doesn't always line up. And that makes developing a cohesive national or pan-Canadian standard kind of challenging, particularly when you need to get people in the same room working together to collaborate on what the requirements should be. Key things to note about how our standards are developed in Canada is that our responsibilities are distributed across a variety of different organizations. So I mentioned Canada Health Infoway. We have the Canadian Institute for Health Informatics. We have HL7 Canada and IHE Canada as affiliates for our respective SDOs. And the other piece to keep in mind is that we're also, a number of our authors and our developers in FHIR are part of grassroots communities. They're authors that are beginning to work in their own jurisdictions and develop guides. And so in a lot of cases, we have jurisdictional guides that are now being developed and kind of entering as a layer into this fray. The other key thing to note is that our incentives are indirect. So that carrot and stick we talked about earlier is really challenging without that regulation and either fines or some form of financial incentive to participate within the standards community. One of the big turning points for us in being able to develop a national standard was our G7 commitment to harmonizing around the International Patient Summary data model. And so I think this is more than just backing into a promise that was made and our jurisdictions and our federal bodies understanding that they needed to do this work. Because I think in our jurisdictions, we saw this also as a pivotal moment, and we saw aspects of patient summary that would be an investment that would be reused to also solve a number of the priorities and the kind of infrastructural pieces that we needed to refresh in our national ecosystem and in our jurisdictional ecosystems. And so that really kind of wakened people up to, it was time to start doing this in fire. So we did our best, and we kind of started on this journey knowing that where we wanted to land, to develop a process for us to kind of negotiate how this works when you have jurisdictions that are coming to the table potentially at different times, that have different requirements, slight differences in their workflow. They have aspects that we have to figure out how to negotiate. And sometimes we find things in international specifications that just don't quite line up to where the real world is at, particularly when we're trying to service across our various 13 jurisdictions. The other piece of this that was really important was, like I said, like figuring out how we manage and marry the requirements domestically, and then also work with the actual project groups at the international level to kind of figure out how that gets negotiated from a standards perspective. So what this looked like was we engaged heavily with IPS over the course of, I want to say, about a year and a half. We worked with them, and through the 1.10 release, we found numerous changes that made it easier to implement an international standard here in Canada. But it wasn't everything that we need. And we'll talk a little bit about sticking points in a bit, but so much to say that even if you are heavily engaged in international spec, sometimes you can't get it to the perfect point. And when you're also seeing jurisdictional guides emerge in your domains, trying to manage the versioning, the how is must support defined and applied, and all the business requirements across these 3-4 concurrent layers is really challenging. And for us, it was really challenging in that ecosystem to make reprofiling work. And just a raise of hands, how many folks are familiar with reprofiling or derivation? Okay, so mixed group. So I'll just, before I hand it off to you, I'll just quick. So when we talk about reprofiling, what we're effectively saying is, can I inherit the requirements from a profile ahead of me? So when we profile in the first place, we're taking a structure definition, and we're basically, if you are developing it from scratch, pulling in all the requirements and structure for how the fire-based resource for condition is described. When I reprofile for something, and what I'm doing is I'm taking the structure definition from the Finnish base or the CA core, and I'm building on top of that. And that's really important for National IGuide authors as a mechanism, because beyond being a way that we can technically create inheritance of these rules, it's also a socio-behavioral mechanism we have available to us to ensure that guides that we see in country are not straying from those rules in a kind of unimpeachable way. And so that's a really fundamental piece. And I think you have a lot of experience, I think, in the reprofiling space with your work with IPA.
All right. So we have been discussing these topics in a group in Connectathon's working group meetings, and there are plenty of countries already involved. And what we've learned is that each country is different in how they deal with these kind of things. So Canada, Finland is not the alternatives. These are just two examples. And the Finnish example is that we originally started with many use cases using FHIR. Some of those were government-funded projects. Some of those were private EHR vendors starting to implement FHIR on their own because they just saw that, hey, it makes sense. It's a new thing that's coming up. We want to adopt it. And then the push to actually develop a Finnish baseline profile came from healthcare organizations that were worried that, okay, we've seen this happen in the past. We adopt some standard, but different implementers are implementing it different ways. And then we lose the interoperability. So it was really the healthcare organizations that pushed HL7 Finland to start the work on harmonizing the base profiles in Finnish level. And something to mention that often comes up is how this is funded. HL7 Finland is funded okay, so the yearly budget is somewhere between 100,000 to 200,000 euros, and that's covered by membership fees that are some hundreds of euros per organization, and then project fees. So we collect project fee, and that's based on the size of the organization that they need to put to HL7 Finland, and the board of HL7 Finland can assign that to projects that they want. And part of the budget last year, they put into this creation of Finnish-based profiles. I think that total budget so far has been some tens of thousands. So when we started, we really wanted to gain the benefits of IPA. And I must be honest here, it was much me. I've been part of generating the IPA specification. I really strongly believe in that. And my background is in app development. So I want my app to be interoperable with all systems across the globe. So I don't see that we should ever mandate anything Finnish specific. But of course, we have our national identifiers, all of that stuff, and it makes sense to outline that in an IG. So really, benefits of IPA, both for app vendors, we can get out of Finland better, we can also get more international apps in Finland, and also the systems, when we purchase systems in Finland, if we harmonize those requirements to global standards, it makes it a lot easier. So we started by deriving our profiles from IPA directly. So we say that this profile extends IPA profile when such a profile was available. And the main reason for that was that we didn't know any better. So since that, we have learned that there are different kind of mechanisms of doing that in a more fine-grained level. We didn't know of those mechanisms back then. And the reprofiling work that Sheridan described, if we would take IPA profile and then just start building our own profile on top of that from scratch, felt like a lot of work. And we tried with just deriving out of IPA profiles, and that gave us so much speed and flexibility, and also guarantees in the Fire shorthand phase when we're actually creating something, and also validating and publishing the IG and then validating the actual resources. Felt so much faster, safer, guaranteed when we just derive out IPA. And a big discussion for us right now is, okay, there are these finer mechanisms that you can say that, okay, this profile complies with, for instance, another profile, and we don't yet have the experience how well the tooling works for that, and do we get alerts when we break something in the interoperability. And yes, the Finnish-based profile 100 is currently balloted and is not officially published, so some final polishing is still to be done before the actual release. And one thing that we have been looking at is the Nordic market area. So the Nordic healthcare system is pretty consistent in Finland, Sweden, Norway, Denmark. So one ambition that we currently have is, can we make the Nordics kind of a joint market area for both apps and systems so that they could target that area? And we are wishing to start harmonizing between all of these. So the Danes have their IG, Norwegians started earliest. Their IG talks Norwegian. We always complain they should select the common Nordic language, that is English, and use that. And Swedes also have their IG. And this is something that we did when Finland was the last to jump on board. So of course we took look at what the Danes have done, Finnish, Norwegians, and Swedish, and now the fonts don't match with your computer. But anyway, Norway and Finland have profiled quite a few resources. Sweden, Denmark, much more focused on singular resources and doing that well. But the key point is that there are only 3 resource types where we have all had something to say. And this would be an opportune moment for all the Nordic countries to start harmonizing before we get to all 157 or so fire resources.
So we want to talk to you a little bit about the efforts so we told you about what we're doing independently in our countries and our regions. But I think part of this has also been a learning experience for us in trying to go to our community of larger implementation guide authors and learn about how the challenges that we're facing in our own approaches could be solved or already are solved in theirs. So though I think the biggest takeaway that I've had in the last year or two is that this is a community that is growing explosively. So there are 30 national bases and cores, I think at the time that I was developing this guide. We've had a number of informal meetups collectively with the National IG authors to talk about, how our standards are being designed in our country, what are the models that we're using. We've had, really good representation at these meetups, but we can always use more countries that are to come to these spaces and be involved, because we know actually there's quite a bit more out there. So I'm just going to touch on some of the themes that we've learned so far from our collaborative, and that's that similar to what Mikhail described about the countries in the Nordic bloc having various states of maturity and the amounts of profiles or guides that they're putting out, we're seeing that to hold true internationally. We use base and core. We use those terms intermixedly, and there isn't really a defined kind of means of kind of classing that we all share. And we'll talk about that more in a second here. Our ecosystems, as another theme, their differences in the way that we operate do actually drive some of the differences amongst our guides, and some of our profiling actions that we take can be tied back to the types of enforcement levers that we have. Many of those in our community are grassroots and unfunded. One big piece here is that, similar to our experience in Canada, a number of countries operate where the control over fire artifacts and guides and ownership is distributed across a number of organizations, which can make kind of interdependencies challenging sometimes. I wanted to point out an emerging framework that we've been working on to try to collate based off of the work that was done in the Netherlands and Norway to try to define how various layers of guides you might expect within a nation to kind of relate to each other. And so this was initially kind of proposed to our HL7 international colleagues, and through our work in the collaborative, we've been able to kind of build it into a new framework to validate our own nation's modeling against. So I'm going to talk through a couple of these definitions in brief. They are 100% in thanks to our colleagues at HL7 Norway in the way that they're described. But I think the big pieces here are a lot of countries have this kind of national abstract profile. And what that means is it's the minimum set of kind of requirements or national adaptations that are necessary to kind of profile a resource within that country. And so these tend to be open, they're very general. The intent for them is typically to be the basis for subsequent, more specific implementation profiles to build on top of. So things we see often here are national identifiers, we see socialized extensions, we see guidance around national information needs, sometimes preferences or example terminology. And then for that next layer down, we start to get a little more specific into use cases. And so these typically look at applying specific constraints around a use case. And that means that that can be reused across implementations kind of either generically or in a more restrictive manner. So similarly, as we go down this kind of chain, these can still be either used directly or further specified. There's two separation points I want to call out here, both in that use case profiles can be kind of generalized or they can be restrictive. And the reason for allowing for both in the framework is that we're seeing this variability in how nations are profiling. Some are, if you're working with a national asset around a use case, you're going to set stricter rules. And so that's where we start to see some of the more restrictive use case profiles show up. The same is true when we look at kind of regional use case profiles. And thanks for the 10-minute warning. And we're able to see usually rules that are around integrations with a regional asset. So this might be expectations on how do you interact with a clinical data store in that region. That might show up in a regional use case profile. The last one, and the one we're probably all familiar with, is this implementation profile. That speaks to what are the expectations around my behavior when I interact with an application service. Here is what it looks like when it's all put together. So the thing I want folks in the room to take away from this is that as implementers, you should see each of these layers kind of like a code snippet that you might be expected to put in your system, or a test script that you might be expected to run when you come to be conformant in our country. And that isn't to say that having many layers is a problem, because if you're doing it well, you should be able to isolate what is independent at each layer. And so you're not duplicating the code you have to write, the tests you have to run. And these kind of operate on a linear scale of open world modeling to closed world modeling. And so as we can move our way down from abstract to kind of more use case or implementation, we start to see things like must supports introduced, more moving from kind of guidance on what terminology should you use or what architectural approaches might be considered, to putting constraints further down in things like the use case profiles that necessitate presence of an element or create conditional rules around when things need to be present. And as you get closer and closer and closer to this kind of implementation profile layer, that's when you start to see things like capability statements, that test scripts, the things that we would actively be utilizing to test within, the expectations within this particular implementation. So when we actually got together and said, how do each of us compare to this framework? We were all over the board. We had some nations that weren't practicing kind of reprofiling at all. We had some that were kind of pulling from layers above, but skipping a number of layers. And that isn't to say that that's a bad thing either, because we all will have kind of different needs for how the layers are used domestically. It's not a bad thing that some layers get skipped some places. I think the challenge that we have mostly is that there are going to be conditions in which the way that we move down in the model becomes more challenging and complex. So reprofiling, if we're just thinking with our own country's perspective in mind, seems like a straightforward approach because it does all of those socio-behavioral things that we were talking about. It makes it easier to isolate what the requirements for a test is and just test for that component. But the challenges start to enter the picture when you're operating in a country where you are publishing profiles and FHIR artifacts across a number of different organizations. You have a regional or jurisdictional layer involved that needs to happen at the same layer. And the kicker is when you're trying to marry an international use case with your base or core. I think this is probably one of the things we found to be most challenging. So I want to just call this out as one of the examples of how current state is currently operating so that we can kind of think beyond how things operate today and talk about in future sessions what mechanisms might be available to us to kind of break outside this mold. So I've got a national core profile represented in kind of human text here. It's saying things like, I want you to acknowledge this extension. If you supply a national identifier, these are your rules. And from that, currently, a lot of use case profiles in nations are derived. So those carry over from the core, and they add things like, I care about you supplying an identifier with a value. Always supply me a patient name. Make sure you support gender, birth date, active and address, and in this case, always supply a patient gender. And I look at the piece on the right, which represents the IPA kind of human readable translation of our requirements. And they look kind of similar. And, they have a lot of the phrases in common. But how do I know? If I have no way of relating these two mechanically, how confident can I be when I show up with an application that's conformant to IPA and this looks slightly different? And I think that's one of the things that we really want to be able to focus in on is like, how are people actively using these? And how can we build assurance as profilers and designers and modelers that we're not just kind of informally aligning to an international use case, and we actively are trying to create an ecosystem where apps and vendors and conformance tools can play together and ensure that the work that's been invested at the international level can be utilized when you come to deploy within a country. The other piece I want to talk about just very briefly on Friday is we have to think about how, beyond a technical perspective, these types of structures facilitate the actual kind of improvements of our resources. So when we have a relationship that's derived, oftentimes when you have a problem with a profile you inherit from, you bring it up at the source. Structures like this, if I find something that just doesn't work within my use case and country, chances are, if I'm not beholden to another guide, I may make changes and delay when I bring up or how I bring up the changes that need to occur. So those things are really critical. So if there's anything that you take away from this presentation, it's that our implementation of international profiles and national profiles, it's a wave that's coming and already begun. Reprofiling may not be enough, depending on what your objectives are within your country, and that potentially we need more sophisticated technical mechanisms as well as community processes to evolve with us as we evolve into this kind of next stage of what it means to be a nation doing FHIR. So I would encourage, if this excites you, come to our Friday roundtable. It's navigating international and national expectations. It's 2:30 at the Freddy, and get involved. We document everything we do. And there's Confluence pages. You can learn all about how your country mapped up to the framework or contributed if you didn't see it named. Okay, good. Oh,
I have one more
takeaway,
and that is that we are all doing this, or many countries are doing this, and the pattern I see is that each party doing their national IG gets the mandate to do that for their country. Mm-hmm. And then whenever I ask, would you like to participate in international discussions about this? They say, no, that's not covered in our mandate. And I think that's wrong, and it should be. So whenever you're starting your next IG project, then make sure that there is a mandate to actually take part in international harmonization of stuff that you're doing.
All right. We got, what, 2 minutes for a question or two?
And anyone has any questions?
Apologies if the stream audio has been poor. I noticed that there are people struggling with that, but it's because this TV speaker is repeating what we say and there is echo.
Yeah.
And we'll try to get that fixed for the next presentations.
Yep. All right.
Yes, I have a question.
Well, maybe not really a question, but a remark. I've very often noticed in this discussion about how should we approach profiles and all this stuff, that there's a lot of confusion as to what do you want to do with a profile. So some people are coming from a position where they say we want to use the profile as a documentation tool, and others come from a position where they say we want to use it purely for validation. Yep. And those sometimes have conflicting interests, and it really helps to get this clear in front right away. Okay, where do you want to use it for? And that really helps with the discussion. So
I was just a comment on that because we've experienced that with our jurisdictions. They're handing a FHIR IGuide to their developers, and that's their mean of communication to say, make sure the asset does this. And I think that's one of the challenges that we have absolutely encountered in Canada across a couple of different jurisdictions. And one of the things that actually we've gotten them really excited about is the obligations concept, which is like, because they think in a technical requirements format, I should expect this actor to elicit this response. And we've made some headway with making folks excited about that, because it is it facilitates more of that as a tool to building for development and maybe building for conformance.
All right, thank you very much. That concludes the session. We're at time. One question further on WUFA, so I invite you to enter that after the question. And thank you all for coming here, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the show.
See you Friday, Freddy.